In the depths of the woods, a secret I can never escape. They say the silence of the woods hides many secrets. For me, it was in a cabin far from home, where stillness spoke louder than words. What began as a simple getaway became a moment I couldn't undo, a moment I can't forget. At 39, I was a wife and mother. But I barely felt like either. My husband, Mark, had become a stranger over the years. His work consumed him, leaving little time for me or our son, Mason. He would spend whatever time he had at home on his laptop or watching TV. And I was left to care for everything else. It hadn't always been like this. I still remember the early days of our marriage when Mark would surprise me with love notes and spontaneous weekends full of laughter and passion. Those memories felt like they belonged to another life, buried beneath the weight of routine and neglect. I tried to revive what we once had: romantic dinners, new lingerie, heartfelt talks, but all were met with indifference. Eventually, I stopped trying. There was no point in reaching out to someone who seemed so distant. When Mark suggested I take Mason to the family cabin for the weekend, I wasn't surprised. "It'll be good for you, too," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "You haven't spent much time together lately." He promised he'd join us later. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. Another excuse would come up. Doesn't every woman know that feeling, the hollow ache when you realize you're more of an afterthought than a priority? Still, I agreed. Maybe I was tired of arguing. Or maybe a part of me hoped the trip would help me find something I'd lost. Mason, at 17, had grown distant. The boy who used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare was now a man, with broader shoulders and a quiet confidence that sometimes unsettled me. I tried to bridge the gap between us, asking about his friends, his school, his life. But the conversations often ended in monosyllabic answers. The silence between us was palpable. As I prepared for the trip, I wondered if I could rediscover the woman I once was, the woman Mark had adored, the mother Mason had once clung to. Would the woods hold the answers to the questions I had long been afraid to ask myself? Would this weekend offer me the chance to find something I hadn't even realized I was searching for? Friday afternoon arrived quickly. As we loaded the car, I noticed how Mason had grown into someone so capable. He effortlessly lifted heavy bags and secured them in the trunk without needing my help. It was such a contrast to the clumsy teenager I remembered, always tripping over his own feet. It filled me with pride, but also sadness. Was this what motherhood felt like, watching your child change into someone you barely recognized? The drive to the cabin was uneventful, yet there was a strange tension in the air. I tried to make small talk, asking about school, his friends, and his weekend plans. "Excited for the getaway?" I asked, glancing at him. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the road. "Yeah, I guess. Just us." "Huh?" I said, trying to keep the conversation going. His response, casual but tinged with something, caught me off guard. Was it curiosity? Amusement? I wasn't sure. But his words lingered in my mind, creating an odd feeling I couldn't shake off. As the cabin came into view, memories rushed back. This place had once been my sanctuary, where Mark and I would escape and reconnect in the early years of our marriage. Back then, it was filled with laughter, shared secrets, and love. Now, it felt empty, just like my relationship with Mark. Mason's voice interrupted my thoughts. "You okay?" "Mom?" he asked. I smiled, though it felt forced. "Just thinking about how long it's been since we've been here." He nodded silently. We entered the cabin. The familiar creak of the wooden steps bringing back memories. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Mason began unloading the car without needing to be asked. Watching him, I realized how much he had changed, taller, more confident. He wasn't the little boy I remembered. And the realization hit me hard. My son wasn't a child anymore. And I wasn't sure how to accept it. Later that evening, as the flames flickered in the fireplace, I poured myself a glass of wine, letting the rich red warmth settle within me. "Do you want some?" I asked, half joking, knowing he'd refuse. But to my surprise, he paused before shaking his head. "No. I'm good." His eyes lingered on me, a silent intensity in his gaze that caught me off guard. Was it admiration? Curiosity? I shifted uncomfortably, the stillness of the cabin settling in. The fire was the only sound that broke the silence. "You've grown up so much," I said softly. He smiled, eyes not leaving mine. "Yeah. I guess I have. And you don't look like most moms. You know." The comment threw me off balance. My cheeks flushed, and I laughed nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Just that you look younger." I wasn't sure how to respond. Was he flirting? Or was there something more to it? Later that night, lying in bed, the silence of the cabin seemed overwhelming. My thoughts raced, replaying our conversation. Was I imagining things? Or was there a shift in how he saw me? I stared at the wooden beams above, their edges softened by the moonlight. The stillness of the night left me uneasy, uncertain. Had I missed something all along? Something that had always been right in front of me? As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend would change everything. The fire's last embers flickered weakly, so I stepped outside into the biting cold to fetch more wood. The weight of the logs dug into my arms as I carried them back. Inside, the cold air rushed in with me, and I felt the strain in my neck, aching like never before. I rubbed the sore spot, feeling the weight of loneliness settle in with the physical exhaustion. "Mom, you look like you're in pain. Let me help," Mason said, his voice deeper than I remembered, startling in its maturity. He stood before me, no longer the boy I once knew but a man, steady and self-assured in this secluded cabin where we were miles from anyone else. His outstretched hands offered something more than relief, they offered connection. I nodded, afraid my voice might betray me, and sank onto the old couch, its creaks mingling with the sound of the fire. I swept my hair aside, exposing the back of my neck. Mason hesitated for a moment before his fingers brushed my skin. His touch was tentative at first, as though afraid to hurt me. But it quickly grew more deliberate. He kneaded the knots in my shoulders with a care that sent an ache through my chest, not from pain, but from the reminder of what I'd been missing for so long. I closed my eyes, letting his hands work their quiet magic. Then, his touch lingered. His movements slowed, became more deliberate, more intimate. I felt the heat of his breath against my neck and heard his breathing shift ever so slightly. I knew I should have stopped him, should have pulled away. But I didn't. I leaned into his hands, desperate for the warmth, the closeness. The reassurance that I was still desirable. Still wanted. His hands moved lower, tracing the muscles of my shoulders and back. And I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. A mix of shame and desire churned in me. Battling for dominance, was it wrong to feel this way about my own son? When his fingertips brushed the space between my shoulder blades, I caught myself arching slightly into his touch. Was my loneliness so consuming that it had twisted into something this dangerous? "Does that feel better?" he asked. His voice low. Almost a whisper. "Yes." I managed, though my voice wavered, betraying the storm of emotions inside me. "Thank you." I wanted to end it there, to retreat back into safety. But I couldn't. Something unspoken tethered us in that moment. Something neither of us was ready to break. Later, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, I stepped out to fetch more wood. My thoughts were a mess, tangled in the memory of Mason's touch and the intimacy of his hands on my skin. I didn't see the ice until it was too late. My foot slipped, and I fell hard, the shock of cold and pain taking my breath away. Mason was there in an instant. His arms were strong and steady as he lifted me, pulling me close to his chest. He carried me back inside, his warmth enveloping me like a shield against the biting cold. He settled me onto the couch, his hands lingering on my arms as though reluctant to let go. In the quiet hum of the cabin, surrounded by firelight and shadows, I realized something had changed. We had crossed a line, one we couldn't uncross. And I wasn't sure whether I wanted to. "Mom. You're hurt," he said, his voice trembling with concern. His hands moved over me, searching for injuries. When he touched my bruised calf, I winced. "Let me see," he insisted, guiding me to the edge of the couch. His touch was gentle as he examined the bruise. But something flickered in his eyes, a hunger that mirrored my own loneliness. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. His fingers lingered, tracing patterns on my skin. And my body betrayed me, craving the warmth of his touch. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, time stood still. The unspoken question in his eyes hung between us. Was this just concern, or something far more dangerous? The fire crackled, its light casting shadows that made him look older, more man than boy. The cabin felt isolated from the world, a universe where rules and boundaries didn't apply. His hands moved higher, and my breath caught in my throat. Was this the connection I had yearned for in my cold, empty marriage bed? I leaned into him, my heart racing, as the lines between us blurred. His touch wasn't just about healing anymore, it was something deeper, something forbidden. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the air was charged with an intimacy I couldn't ignore. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in snow. The peaceful scene outside was at odds with the chaos in my heart. I lay motionless, staring at the frosted glass, the weight of guilt pressing down on me. The fire in the hearth had died, and the cabin was cold. But I barely felt it. My thoughts were a mess of regret and longing. What had we done? The night replayed in my mind, each moment a reminder of the lines we had crossed. The snow sparkled in the morning light, pristine and untouched, mocking me with its purity. But inside, I felt anything but pure. The knot in my stomach tightened as I realized there was no undoing what had happened. Nothing would ever be the same again. What had happened last night? The memory lingered, sharp yet elusive, taunting me with fragments I couldn't piece together. Every stolen glance, every unspoken word weighed heavily on me. The sound of movement behind me pulled me from my thoughts. Mason was stirring, the sofa bed creaking beneath him. I froze, pretending to sleep, hoping to avoid the tension that loomed between us. Mason didn't speak. I listened to his soft footsteps and the rustle of cookware. He moved carefully, almost too carefully, as if trying not to disturb the delicate silence. With a reluctant sigh, I sat up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. When I glanced over, he was by the counter, pulling out a skillet and eggs. His back to me. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse. He looked at me briefly, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he replied, returning to his task. The air felt thick with everything unsaid, a weight neither of us was willing to address. "You're making breakfast?" I asked, desperate to fill the silence. "Yeah," he said simply. "Figured we should eat before packing up." The casualness of his words felt forced, as if he, too, was avoiding something. I watched his hands move with precision as he cracked the eggs and whisked them. His movements deliberate yet oddly restrained. Something about him felt different this morning, quieter, guarded. "Do you need any help?" I offered hesitantly. "I've got it," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. We ate in near silence, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. I kept my eyes on my food, but I could feel his gaze, steady and questioning. When I finally glanced up, our eyes met briefly. There was something in his expression, raw, unspoken, a question he wasn't ready to voice. My breath caught, and I quickly looked away, unsure of what I was feeling. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was heavy with everything unresolved. Whatever had happened last night wasn't over. It lingered in the air, waiting for one of us to break the fragile truce. But neither of us was ready. "Not yet." "Mason," I began, but my voice faltered. He didn't reply, only gave a slight nod before turning away. After breakfast, we packed in silence. Mason carried the heavy bags to the car, his movements deliberate. I stayed behind, cleaning and trying to calm my spiraling thoughts. When Mark came back that afternoon, his cheerful voice broke the stillness. "Looks like the storm didn't trap you two for long," he said, stomping snow off his boots. "Barely," I replied, forcing a smile. "The snow was bad last night." He kissed my cheek, warm but distant. "How was the cabin?" "Survive without Wi-Fi?" he joked. Mason shrugged. "It was fine." "Quiet," he said, his tone flat. Mark didn't notice the tension and chatted about his trip, oblivious to the cracks forming in the room. Mason's gaze lingered on me, heavy with unspoken questions. "Hey, Mason," Mark said, patting his son's shoulder. "Thanks for helping your mom. You're a good kid." Mason stiffened under the touch, muttering, "No problem," his jaw tight. That night, as Mark slept peacefully, I lay awake, thoughts racing. What was I doing? What had I let happen? And how could I fix it? The answers didn't come, leaving me adrift in the quiet, unsure if I'd ever find them. As the days passed, the weight of what had happened in that cabin pressed heavier on my heart. The guilt, The confusion. The sense of betrayal, it lingered like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. Mason and I said little to each other in the days that followed. The connection we shared, once tender and innocent, had morphed into something unspoken, something forbidden. Each glance felt like a question we weren't ready to answer. Yet we both knew that nothing could undo what had been done. I tried to return to normalcy, to pretend that the weekend had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness. But it was impossible. The consequences of that weekend shaped every interaction with my husband and son moving forward. My marriage, already fragile, cracked further. Mason, though still my son, seemed like a stranger I could no longer reach. And I, forever trapped between what I had allowed and what I wished I could forget, was left questioning every choice I'd ever made. The truth is, sometimes our desires, our loneliness, and our fears can blur the lines between what is right and what feels comforting in the moment. In the end, it is the courage to face the consequences, to confront the truth about ourselves, and to seek the healing we need that will guide us out of the darkness. No connection, no matter how intense, is worth sacrificing the boundaries that define us. To anyone who finds themselves in a place where the weight of their choices threatens to crush them, my advice is this: take a step back. Seek help. Lean on the people who truly care for you. Sometimes, the answers we need lie in places we're too afraid to look. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss future videos. Together, we can explore the complexities of human emotion, relationships, and the unexpected twists life has in store.